All right, so can we just start off with an introduction? I know you're an attorney. Like, what kind of law you practice? Who you are.
Yeah, I'm, I'm in my mid 50s. I'm 54. I'm from New Jersey, but I spent many decades in California before going up to law school at Northwestern School of Law in Portland, Oregon. I went off to Cambridge for a year and studied environmental law. Came back and passed the Washington Bar in 1996. I've been practicing law in Washington for 20 years. Pretty much, if you go onto the WSBA.org website, you can see my specialties. I have many specialties in the sense that I try to handle what the people of Washington bring to me. So whether it's a crim defense, personal injury, an estate planning matter, Social Security disability advocacy, state regulatory practice, banking problems, foreclosure defense. I pretty much practice in a wide area to serve the people of my adopted state of Washington. I'm a member of both the Washington State Bar Association and the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington, which pretty much covers going north from Portland, basically Vancouver, Olympia, Tacoma, and Seattle. So I travel that I-5 corridor a lot between both state and federal courts on the west side of the Cascades in Washington State. I have 6 post-secondary degrees. I earned a BA in history from UCLA in 1984. That was publicly conferred, but I also completed 36 quarter units and was granted a BS in advanced mathematics from the Naval Postgraduate School at UCLA. There's a branch of it there at UCLA, but that was conferred secretly. That's something you might actually want to write an article about it. There's been a program at UCLA since World War II that essentially prepares civilians to be called up as naval officers in the event that they need to call people up in the event of, for example, World War. So I completed that, but that degree is not something that the registrar at UCLA confirms. It was conferred by the Naval Postgraduate School, and they won't even talk to anybody about who attended their different programs at UCLA. So anyway, I was pretty much focusing on my history studies. I wrote for the Daily Bruin. I became a journalist in Los Angeles, wrote for different periodicals. I worked with Norman Cousins for a while in Los Angeles at UCLA. I wrote for the Cousteau Society as a young environmental journalist, then went off to Portland to study environmental law. And then after I got my law degree, I earned 2 advanced degrees in environmental law and planning. One earned with distinction at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and then a Master of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge. So, I'm an educated person. I've been practicing law for 20 years at the state and federal level. And around 2000, maybe after I've been practicing law for 4 or 5 years, I look back and I examined the fact that in childhood, growing up in New Jersey, I had been involved in some very unusual activities that related to my father's work. My father was a Defense Department engineer. He was officially employed by the Ralph M. Parsons Company of New York and then of Pasadena, California. Unofficially, he had worked on secret aerospace projects for the U.S. government from the time that the Ramjet was being built at Curtiss-Wright in 1952 to 55, all the way through his retirement in 1984. Sometime in the mid-1960s, my father was brought into a U.S. time-space program that was being organized under DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They were essentially creating an intelligence funnel and putting all information that they could glean from ancient sources, extraterrestrial sources, contemporary foreign sources like the Nazi German and the Soviet Russian experiments with time travel, and the works of brilliant people like Nikola Tesla. And they were trying to derive a capability within the U.S. government to gather intelligence about past and future events and conditions, and individuals for that matter, utilizing either sending something to the past or future physically or modeling holograms of past and future events. That project became known as Project Pegasus. I was brought into it unofficially in the winter of 1968 as a first grader, growing up in New Jersey. When my father and I teleported from the old Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility, where he had worked on the Ramjet project in the early 50s, to the New Mexico State Capitol grounds in several seconds. So my point here is that when I was brought into Pegasus, initially at age 6.5, but then officially at age 8 in the beginning of my third grade school year, when I was September born, so I entered third grade at age 7 and quickly became age 8. I was brought into a classified defense project, and I retained my memories of what happened in that project. Around 2000, I began to examine what had happened, primarily to write a book about my experiences and try to get it placed as a feature film, basically sell film rights. But what ended up evolving was a secondary career as a lawyer, where I became associated with the revelation publicly of the true history of time travel within the U.S. government. And so I've been doing that since, publicly, my first talk was in October of 2004. So 12 years ago, after investigating what happened to me for 3 or 4 years, I then began speaking publicly. I began appearing on radio in 2009, television in 2010. And I've done about, this is just an estimate, but it's a fair estimate, I've done probably about 10 national and local TV shows and about 100 radio and podcasts, everything from podcasts that 100 people have been listening to, all the way through 8 appearances on Coast to Coast AM, which is one of the largest radio shows in the world. And I've done about 25 public talks that will last either the better part of a day or actually all weekend, where I share my experiences with the public. I'm talking about 2 actual defense projects, and I have done my research. I've done 3 major fact-finding trips to New Mexico. I've done a fact-finding trip to New Jersey. I've gotten confirmations of the existence of the program by 12 different Americans whose stories I will be telling in my book. I spoke with some of the kids that I was in my immediate training group with in New Jersey, who remembered a device called the Montauk chair being present in our learning lab at my public elementary school in Jersey. So I really spent, thousands of dollars and thousands of hours going back and reality testing my memory. I was a member of the bar, and I have basically an ongoing abiding duty to police not just my conduct as an attorney, not just the decisions I make, but my mental state, my physical state, to see if I can give my clients zealous advocacy. So I was under an abiding ethical duty to evaluate whether my memories were true. And after several years of investigating, I ruled out every other possibility, mind control, fantasy, delusion, mistake, influence from the mass media, and so forth, every other possibility. So I haven't published my book yet, but I basically have it blocked out. It's going to be coming out when I finish it. But along the way, I became a public figure. And I'm an intelligent public figure. I'm a past member of Mensa, highly educated, and I'm a serious person. I haven't been, manipulating or deceiving the public. I'm a serious person bringing serious information to the American people. For example, if we had implemented the Tesla teleportation technology that Project Pegasus researched and developed based on paperwork that actually began in Colorado Springs, Colorado in 1899, when Tesla began working on teleportation. Said experimentation, which my father repeated upon the request of the government when he was employed at the Thomas A. Edison Research Lab in West Orange, New Jersey from 1956 to 64. That's how my dad got pulled from more conventional, secret aerospace projects like high-performance jet aircraft into the emerging time-space program, getting people from point A to point B, not in a jet aircraft, but by traveling through time and space. And so, I lost my train of thought here, but basically, I realized
that's totally fine. I will get into several different things here.
So that's basically my story. Basically, what's of significance to the public is that I'm a whistleblower. I'm a highly educated whistleblower. I'm professionally successful. I'm stable. I've been practicing law for 20 years without a without a client complaint even. And I investigated what happened to me, and I became a public figure by being essentially the whistleblower that ended government secrecy in the United States around time travel. So that's essentially my life story. I not only helped pioneer time travel as one of the 140 child participants in Project Pegasus, but I then brought the information forward, first as a whistleblower waging a truth campaign, and now as a candidate for the presidency. So that's my basic life story, and that's that's why my 100 proposals may seem somewhat eclectic. Admittedly, I'm entering the presidential race from an unconventional background. A lawyer who time traveled in childhood, was involved in the Second Defense Project during his college years. And I've become essentially sort of a whistleblower entertainer in a sense, a kind of a lecture giver. In other words, I've been primarily utilizing the tradition of storytelling to inform the American people of the great technical accomplishments that we ourselves made, our common culture achieved, but which were kept secret because they were weaponized by the Defense Department. And that led me into politics.
Okay.
Process
yeah, that's
being,
great.
Becoming a whistleblower.
As far as an introduction, that's awesome. And you actually answered a couple questions I had in there. So, I don't want to sound curt, but I've gone through your 100 proposals, and I've got about 25 questions, and we'll hit everything from time travel and UFOs to or defense and less sexy things like FOIA requests. If that's okay with you.
Sure, fire away.
So
I'll try to answer more shortly. Since you have 25 questions, I'll try to be more curt myself, more brief in my response.
By all means, but I might cut you off. But hey, listen, I love Coast to Coast, so I understand the format.
Yeah. And that's the emerging culture. I just mentioned with Dr. Brooks Agnew, and his conception is, we have a culture, we have an establishment, and we all identify with it one way or the other. It's politics, it's science, it's religion, it's academia. But there is a para-establishment that's emerging in the United States. Brooks estimates that 65 to 70% of the adult American population essentially belongs to that sort of that intellectual movement that's starting around non-ordinary material. It's a large group, but it's been described as the cultural creative niche of about 40 to 50 million Americans and Canadians. But Brooks conceives of it as a para-establishment where, for example, if you approach people on the street in New York City, about 2 people out of 3 would know what chemtrails were and have something passively intelligent to say about them. That's what's happening in our country. Our country is bifurcating between an establishment that lies to everybody and a resurgent American sort of renaissance, an intellectual renaissance or movement that is trying to find out the truth about the reality that we live in. And I'm part of that movement. I'm part of that renaissance.
Okay. So, in that case, let's address I took no offense in your message, but I do want to find out exactly what you may have taken issue with, because I want to make sure that none of my other questions are off base.
Actually, it's not germane to your work, but it's really germane. My response to that question is really germane to what's going on in our presidential election process. I drafted a fully cognized set of 100 proposals that were well crafted that indicated where I would try to take the country as president. The mainstream candidates simply have not done that. Let's just take Trump, Clinton, Cruz, and Sanders, for example. Okay? If you were just to isolate one issue, I mean, I have six or seven fully cognized proposals, I think it's 7, that relate to the broad question of extraterrestrial life. I have the one about the disclosure of ET life, the one about disclosure of hidden technologies, the one about disclosing our time travel arsenal, and then the ones about the moon, the lunar program, Mars, and then the secret space projects and secret treaties, and also the FOIA one, which would relate to that. So when you did your article, the concept of your article was, who is the most UFO friendly? I would say ET friendly. Who is the most ET disclosure friendly of the candidates? And instead of legitimately covering my elaborate plan that I'm presenting to the American people of what I would do to bring about ET disclosure, or whatever you want to call it, the truth about UFOs, I was dismissed in the same way as I was in the Huffington Post as a joke. And you didn't tell the truth about what my campaign embodies. You used me as a foil, as a joke at the end of the article. And in fact, since you were taking the front runners, and then you took Ed Baker and I as independent, I don't really know who Ed Baker is, if that's in fact his name, I forget but the other guy that you mentioned at the bottom of the article. You put a cartoon of an octopus, and then you didn't cover my platform. And that's un-American. That's anti-democratic. I have a right not to be defamed when I'm running for president. My life has been on the line as a whistleblower. I don't have Secret Service protection. My life is now on the line as a presidential candidate. To get on the California, to qualify to have my votes as a write-in candidate counted in California, for example, for the June 7th primary in California, I had to reveal my current residential address in North Carolina. Okay, so I put my campaign headquarters in a house here in North Carolina. So I'm a real candidate. I did the honest thing and the forthcoming thing with the American people in a tradition of presidential candor that goes all the way back to George Washington, right? I mean, it was Washington who supposedly said, at least generations of American school children were said that it was Washington who mouthed the famous words, "It was I, Father, I chopped down the cherry tree." And then we had another great president, Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, who was known as Honest Abe because he was always striving to tell the truth. We've enshrined transparency in government in things like the Freedom of Information Act, okay? And that's what I've delivered in my 100 proposals. And yet, you basically caricatured my proposals, and you didn't reveal to your readers that unlike the 4 or 5 quote-unquote establishment candidates that you analyzed at length, I have a fully crafted, fully thought out, fully honest disclosure platform. I'm running as a figure in the truth movement and somebody who has already been recognized for years as a whistleblower. And so that's what I take objection. I take objection to the fact that in the very process of trying to be honest with American voters, with the voters, in the very process of putting my own personal and professional reputation on the line to reveal the truth to the American people, and then to distill it into a presidential platform, that didn't get told in your article. What the reader got told in your article was that I was some kind of kook who could be readily dismissed, or somebody who was saying things that were so controversial that I had no chance of getting elected. Well, I've done mainstream media, and the response has been off the charts. When I do Coast to Coast AM, the whole board lights up. I have one of the highest arbitrons in the history of the program. So I'm bringing real answers to real questions, many of which embody real, honest, well-thought-out proposals. And I felt that in your article, I was caricatured, and my proposals were caricatured. And also, according to the own conceit of the article that you arrived at as a journalist, which again, I think it was Geraldo Rivera who said that in journalism there is no objectivity because story story selection itself is subjective, right? So you decided, or Gawker decided, to do a piece on, and I think it's a very interesting conceit as an article, on your conceit, I think it's fair to say, was, who are the most ET disclosure-friendly candidates? How do they stack up? And you didn't report accurately about me because you wanted to caricature me and to some extent ridicule me, but notwithstanding the fact that I beat all of the others hands down in terms of being the quote-unquote UFO-friendly, or I would say ET disclosure-friendly candidate for Americans who are interested in that critical issue. And it's just not honest. It's not accurate. But beyond that, it's not honest because I've been a public figure now since 2004. I've been in the mainstream media for 7 years. I have these well-crafted, thought-out proposals. What has Trump been talking about? He gets up in front of audiences of people and talks about building a 30-foot wall for the 1,500-mile border that we share with Mexico. Does that sound at all sane to you? Where is his platform? Where is Ted Cruz's platform? The research of my campaign team, Andy 2016, revealed that of the 18 or 19 original mainstream or establishment Democrat or Republican candidates, namely those who were being regarded as viable because they had been members of the House, the Senate, or state governors, or very prominent business people like Trump and Fiorina, only one of them had published a platform, and that was Rubio of Florida, who's now out of the race. None of the others had published a platform. I published 100 proposals, 6 or 7 of them which happen to be directly germane to the conceit of your article, and I got so caricatured that I wasn't really reported about before having my name and candidacy placed before a cartoon of an octopus. That's not honest, Brett. That's not honest journalism.
You will get absolutely no argument from me on most all of your points. That's what this interview is about, right? Correcting that record.
Okay, that's fair. I respect you. You're a good writer, and like I said, now that I'm in my 50s, I don't want to sound too avuncular, but I was helped by a lot of brilliant people as a young man. I wrote for Jacques Cousteau. I had a friendship with Buckminster Fuller. I was a protege of Norman Cousins at UCLA. So I was helped by, people whose biographies now appear in the Encyclopedia Britannica. So part of my career involves spending time with younger Americans and trying to make the kind of investment that some great Americans made in me, that me, humbly speaking, not as if I'm a great American, but that I can make in younger people who are striving for excellence. So I could tell that you are, and that's why I reached out to you, so that I can not be bitter and say, well, okay, Rhett Jones published a hit piece against me, but really try to communicate to you so that you can do the best possible work.
Well,
that was my motive.
Yeah, I don't know. We can talk about it further later, but the fact is that your term drive-by journalism isn't inaccurate, and that's just kind of the way things go. And the fact is, I'm not going to say you weren't a casualty as far as a joke goes there, but all I would say is don't take it personally, and it's more about a joke of our system of not taking any candidate outside of the Democratic or Republican process seriously at all. That photo above wasn't necessarily to represent you. It was just an old Simpsons reference to a time where they did a episode where 2 aliens took over the election, and everyone found out they were aliens, and the town's upset that they're aliens, and and the aliens are well, what are you gonna do? It's a 2-party system, so they have to vote for one of the aliens, I
may file a Supreme Court challenge against the state of California for requiring that they basically, and I guess maybe the Supreme Court would rule that it's a state prerogative, but on the California ballot, I just filed a form to have my votes in the California primary counted. This isn't as digressive as it seems. Let me explain. California requires that you file with a party in seeking the presidency, and that's not in Article 2. So, I mean, in other words, they are imposing a requirement that you also be affiliated with, I think it's 6 parties. It's like the Republicans, the Democrats, Peace and Freedom, the Green Party, the Libertarians, and one other, I don't know. And so that might be more of a legitimate political article for you if I did do that, if I did basically contest the fact that California is adding a condition to the presidential eligibility requirements stated in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5. But I know that we're locked into this Republican-Democratic, dialectic. But that doesn't mean that somebody who is qualified to run for, in my view, as a former journalist, that I don't think that, I know that you're Gawker.com, so I'm sure that it's quite legitimate for a political journal like Gawker to have a facetious tone. But I just objected to the fact that by not fitting into that formula of being, let's say, a Democratic senator from, some state, or a former member of the House, or present member of the House, or, a governor of a state, and so forth, that running as a citizen, that I didn't qualify, in the act of being covered, I didn't qualify for the legitimate reporting that the establishment candidates got, and then I was, to some extent, ridiculed or satirized or criticized unfairly. I just think that in an ostensibly democratic society, if somebody's going to be covered, it seems like I deserved as much verbiage as they got, and also, sort of the non-caricaturing tone that they got. Because look, the reason I might not be viable as a candidate is simply because I'm running as a write-in candidate, or I'm running as an independent. I mean, those factors constrain the ability of any American to run for and and be elected president. But in fact, my proposals are very sound, and I think they're very responsive to the actual situation that we find ourselves in. And let me just say in prescript for the rest of the interview, my proposals have been called by both political pundits and different individuals posting on Facebook. They've been called awesome, brilliant, unrivaled, genius in print, mind-blowing, and a life experience to read. So this again points up this breakout we have between the establishment view and the para-establishment view. Those 6 commendatory comments about my proposals came from the para-establishment, either political journal writers from sort of the greening of the country, but here, Gawker is kind of positioning itself as a satirical establishment publication, and the fact that I am a sane and intelligent citizen who's making sound public policy suggestions got totally lost. That's really what I'm referring to.
Yeah,
I know that you guys.
I do understand. I do.
Look at Hunter Thompson. I mean, some of the best political reporting in the country has been trenchantly satirical.
Absolutely.
And so I read that. I'm a political junkie, and I love satirical political content. I laugh out loud at it because I love the drama and also the comedy of American politics.
I don't resent that. I'm sorry. Let me just interrupt right there, just for 1 second. But definitely, let me tell you that, it pains me to, think that you felt like I was punching down, and that's not really what I intended to do. Which is why, let's get down to business, right? Let's cover these policies.
Okay, cool. Yeah, okay. So anyway, that's yeah. So enough said. It sounds like I understand where you're coming from, and so let's do it. Just fire away.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let me hit something that's not UFO related at first. Because I understand. I read through your 100 policies, and so is my editor. And we've talked about it, and there's a lot of stuff in there. So you're campaigning on the to use your title, defensive defense policy, right?
Yeah.
Which is I'm taking is similar to to use a dirty word, isolationism. But Only attack when attacked, kind of deal.
It's I would describe it as neo-isolationist.
Right.
Admittedly, avowedly, I believe that we are suffering from imperial overreach. We are stigmatizing our reputation around the world. We are violating the very Nuremberg principles that we helped frame, that we basically initiated, not during the trial of the lawyers and judges, but the Nazi high command. And that outlawed conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. We've begun conspiring to wage aggressive war. And so in the last 25, 30 years, we've departed from American principle, which was neo-isolationist. We had the admonishment of President Washington in his farewell address to avoid entangling alliances, right? We had the Monroe Doctrine that basically we would come to the defense of countries that respected our borders and ask for our intervention. We are isolated geographically from the rest of the world, much of the rest of the world, just as a virtue of geography. We have become the policemen of the world. And even during the Vietnam era, Americans would say to themselves and to each other, well, we have a defensive defense policy. That's why we changed the name of the War Department to the Defense Department after World War II. We were signaling to the world that we would only use our phenomenal and totally admirable military might in defense of our country or its interests. But we've departed from that established doctrine. That's all I'm calling for in that proposal, is an awareness that we've departed from that doctrine and that we should once again adopt a defensive defense policy. So that doesn't mean, for example, if a foreign nation is... Sorry, go ahead. I cut you off, sorry.
Well, I'm sorry. How would this, like... A lot of these things we have to frame within, the national conversation. So, how is this going to relate to our conflict with ISIS?
Well, ISIS has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. It committed a very heinous war crime when it burned to death the Jordanian pilot in a cage. It is a violation of the Geneva Convention and the Nuremberg principles to execute POWs, even by a firing squad or a guillotine or something that's relatively swift. And that poor pilot spent several minutes dying by being burned alive. They've also committed crimes against humanity because when you kill people, especially non-combatants, because of an indelible characteristic, their nationality, their race, their color, their religion, their sexual orientation, what party they belong to, you're committing genocide. Okay, so they were committing genocide by beheading Christians. Okay, in the same way that Saddam Hussein committed genocide by attacking the Kurds of northern Iraq as an ethnic group. So in the case of ISIS, a defensive defense policy that makes exceptions in the area of policing and preventing and also prosecuting what are called violations of norms use cogents, which are those principles that are so fundamental to our civilization that public international law recognizes that we have a right, every nation has a right to prohibit them. Things like genocide, slavery, torture, piracy on the high seas. We have a complete right, even if we're operating under a defensive defense policy, to prosecute a war against ISIS as a military organization because they're committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. We would have a right to do it unilaterally in conflict with one other country or military group or in an international coalition. Also, the Desert Storm, when an international coalition was organized to topple the regime, not Desert Storm, but the Iraq War, when an international coalition was raised to topple Saddam Hussein, that was a legitimate exercise of American military power under my proposal for the same reason. Saddam Hussein had violated all four elements of the Nuremberg principles. He had conspired to wage aggressive war, he had waged such war, and he had committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. So same thing with ISIS.
So just to be clear, like crimes against humanity count as crimes against the state.
No, crimes against humanity are prohibited under public international law, so that when any nation state or coalition of nation states goes to war against a nation state or a terrorist group that is committing crimes against humanity, it is a legitimate use of force. It basically satisfies the use of force doctrine. So in my proposal, I'm essentially synthesizing the use of force doctrine by stating that even though we would adopt a defense policy that would be defensive in its orientation. In other words, its first principle would be that we would try to constrain our military conduct or military activity in the defense of the country and not to wage aggressive war. One of the primary exceptions to that abiding doctrine would be that it's legitimate to prevent and to also prosecute things like war crimes and crimes against humanity. So if a regime commits crimes against humanity, that country can be invaded and that regime toppled, like we toppled the regime of Saddam Hussein. If a terrorist group is doing it, same thing. It's legitimate under public international law for any country to punish a country and stop violations, to wage a military assault on another country or group to stop violations of norms, use, cogents. It's already framed in public international law as a legitimate use of force to do that. And I believe we should continue to do that. When we can make that case before the world community, and preferably in concert with partners, not unilaterally. We shouldn't be the policeman of the world. But if, for example, there's a regime, let's say like Libya, where Gaddafi was planning to print a gold-backed currency or begin accepting some other currency besides dollars for his oil sales, it's not a legitimate use of force to say, well, we have a national interest, therefore we can invade and topple the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. That was not a legitimate use of force under my policy. Our country wasn't going to be invaded or attacked, and Gaddafi and his regime were not clearly violating. They were not clearly committing either war crimes or crimes against humanity. There was one story that suggested that he was some kind of sexual creep and he had rape rooms where he was raping women. Well, that would be a crime against humanity, but it would be unclear whether that was a crime for which he could be assassinated or arrested, or his whole regime and government toppled. I mean, nobody suggested that Canada or Great Britain or France could invade the United States militarily, let's say the former Soviet Union and its army, because Nixon and Kissinger had committed war crimes by bombing Cambodia. Okay, so in the case of any criminal acts by Muammar Gaddafi, those might form the basis for his arrest or for his execution coincident to an arrest, like if we had to use military force to arrest him and he ended up dying. But it would not be a case for invading his country, killing his citizens, and toppling his regime. See, in other words, we've gone beyond the post-war policy that we use military force to defend either our country or abiding principles of international law, and we've begun to resort to the policy of utilizing military force simply to enforce our will and our self-interest around the world, and that is illegal. Okay? Under justification, it would have been justified for the Nazi regime to invade Poland and Czechoslovakia in September of 1939 under its policy of Lebensraum, which you may remember was the Nazi policy of getting more land for its population. Countries don't have a right to wage war merely in the defense of their broad interests. They only have the authority under public international law to wage war to defend themselves from attack or invasion, or to enforce human rights, to enforce the maintenance of norms, use, cogents. That's it.
I think that's
everything
clear.
else is illegal. Yeah, sorry.
I think that's clear. Or like your position is clear.
Yeah.
So
I'm not
if you'll let me just
military, by
pivot.
the way. You know, I'm a proud American. I'm proud of our military. We have a fine military, and in fact, in the past, I broadly supported. None of them run, but I've supported the notion that it wouldn't hurt us for a General David Jones of the Air Force or a General Wesley Clark of the Army to become president. I mean, some of our military leaders are very brilliant individuals, and I think we have a fine military and an incredibly courageous military. I just don't think that we should be operating enforcing our national interests by attacking and invading other countries. I think we need a higher justification than that.
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense. So, okay, hot button issues. First off, war. Everybody loves war. Second off, guns. I know that you support limitations on gun ownership by the violent and mentally ill. Do you support a ban on assault rifles?
Yes. I believe the right to keep and bear arms was established to allow the people to raise a militia, the people of the states, of the separate states, to raise a militia to defend the state from other states, from the United States as a collective, and from other countries and groups. Excuse me. I also believe, as an extension of that, at the individual level, that people have the right to keep and bear arms to defend themselves. But I don't believe that can be extended into the unjustifiable area of people owning weapons of war. You don't need a weapon of war to defend yourself. I mean, even during these school shootings, if somebody had, a 380, a Ruger 380 or some kind of serviceable, marginally serviceable handgun, all it takes is one bullet to take down some lunatic who starts shooting up, the town square, the campus. So, no, I support a ban on assault weapons, and I believe, in fact, that both the people holding them and the local and state police forces that are holding weapons of war, things like tanks, assault weapons, and so forth, should be compelled to surrender them to their local army arsenals. But that doesn't mean I support a across-the-board ban on personal defense weapons, such as we saw in Australia, where everybody was basically ordered to turn in all their guns. I also believe, as a corollary of the sort of the mass shooting epidemic in the country, where there's a mass shooting every day now in America, that in the same way that we should make gun ownership unlawful and impossible for those who their criminal or mental history comes up showing either a pattern of violence or a pattern of insanity as found by their physician or psychiatrist. We should also encourage gun ownership among those who have no such records, no record of mental illness, no record of violence, of criminal violence, because the people have a right to defend themselves, and police forces can't. Everybody talks about America being too policed. In fact, while we have an epidemic of police violence, we don't have a police state in the sense that we have too many police officers. In Los Angeles County, what are there, 13 million people? And there's like 8,000 LAPD and 4,000 county sheriff, right? We're not awash in gendarmes and police officers. In fact, the response time of the police and sheriff deputies in most major city areas, they're just coming to basically to file a report on what happened, not to interdict violence and to save human life and prevent death and injury. For example, when somebody starts shooting. So I believe that the population of people, the vast majority of people who are sane and nonviolent, should be holding weapons. So my gun control position is dovetailed with a gun advocacy position. And I credit my thinking on that.
While you're on the point, let me quickly ask. While you're on the point of, what do you think? I mean, you acknowledge that there's an issue with police violence. What exactly do you want to do about that?
I've seen this up front because I was a witness in an egregious assault on a beautiful young woman in Portland, Oregon back in 2006. And so that really influenced my thinking on police violence. Basically, we cannot rely on county and state prosecutors to prosecute acts, either criminal acts of police violence or where the victim of police violence, of the egregious unlawful use of police force, where somebody's, suing, actually they have recourse to the federal district courts under Bivens to get damages, monetary damages for deprivation of civil liberties by a government official operating under color of authority. That includes state and local police. But the problem is that when somebody becomes a victim of police violence, the local and sometimes the state prosecutors will charge them with bogus crimes, so they have a criminal history that attaches to the fact pattern that gave rise to the police violence. And that usually prevents the person from even getting counsel to sue under Bivens, to sue under the federal tort claim, to get damages in a federal court against a local or state officer. So I think that we should mandatorily change the jurisdiction of acts of police violence so that the police are prosecuted by an aggressive Attorney General of the United States, and so that all local and state acts of the use of force that are scrutinized at the local and state level would automatically be kicked into federal court, and the individuals would be prosecuted for committing federal crimes. In other words, I think we should make local and state police violence a federal crime, and that'll protect the civil rights of the victims. Right now, as I saw where I was a witness to a woman just having the hell beaten out of her, having her nose broken on the pavement by a Portland police officer merely because she asked him a nonviolent, non-threatening question. I was 5 feet away from her, and he just picked her up and smacked her in the face on the sidewalk. She had difficulty finding counsel for her Bivens action and had the crimes that she was convicted of that were bogus, that the Multnomah County prosecutor charged her with in Portland, Oregon. That hurt her at the federal level, and she ultimately did not get any monetary relief for the attempted murder that was perpetrated against her by a Portland police officer. So what we need to do basically is we need to kick all incidents where police violence by local and state officers is alleged into the federal criminal court system and try those officers with aggressive prosecution, at least scrutiny by the Attorney General, because, prosecutors have discretion. And in cases where the person invited the police violence by their conduct, obviously those cases wouldn't be prosecuted. But in cases where law-abiding citizens become victims of police violence, those, I think, should immediately become federal criminal actions so that the federal civil rights of the victims are safeguarded. Right now, they're not. They're basically being wrenched away from legitimate victims of police violence those who have not been guilty of any kind of provocation of the officer because of this abiding practice now of filing false criminal charges against victims of police violence. It's an epidemic in this country. In the case of where I was the primary witness for a woman who was virtually killed by the officer, that officer had put 8 citizens of Portland in the hospital that year and had 33 citizens' complaints for the excessive use of force leveled against him during his career as a police officer in Portland. So, the way it now stands, a dog, it can come in a dog bite case that if there were, if a local dog had put 8 or 9 citizens of Portland in the hospital with dog bite and had 33 complaints to the local animal control people about being loose and biting people and so forth and menacing neighbors, it's easier in America now to prosecute that dog civilly and bring about its having it put down as a violent animal than it is to even get into federal district court when a police officer acts violently, acts as a chronically violent police officer. And that's a travesty. That means we're putting the lives of canines above the lives of human beings, essentially, at this point. That's a national travesty. The American people should be more protected from violence by out-of-control police officers than even out-of-control dogs, right? I mean, come on.
I don't think you'll ever get an argument on that one.
Yeah.
So let's say, or like on that specific, or a related question of this woman as a victim. You one of your platforms is equal rights for women, and you outline it as specifically in the workplace and the ways that you want a policy of companies being fined if they're found to pay women less than a man in the same position. But I didn't see anything about abortion, and I just wanted to know what your stance is on abortion.
Well, I think abortion should be discouraged because, while it can be debated whether or not the fetus is a human life, I think all of us would agree it's potentially a human life. So on abortion, I take the position that was voiced by feminist leaders like Petra Kelly, where you want to discourage as much abortion as possible because every pregnancy is a potential human being. And who among us would want our own life and destiny as a human being intermitted via abortion? So it comes down to a basic sanctity of life issue that we want to promote. We might even want to pay women to bring babies to term, but we certainly want to promote things like delivery, in other words, hospice for pregnant women like unwed mothers to bring their babies to term and deliver them. But at the end of the day, pregnancy is a biological phenomenon occurring within the body of the woman who's pregnant. And so I believe as a human right, at least before the time in the pregnancy where the baby could thrive outside the mother's womb, she ultimately controls the process. So I wouldn't say that I'm pro-abortion. I'm pro-choice, but with the caveat that to make pro-choice truly humane, we should do everything in our power to bring every pregnancy to term. And you might know that that's not the policy of either.
Legally. What do you think legally in this situation, though?
Legally, I believe that women should have the right to choose abortion before the third trimester. In terms of public policy, I think that the abortion policy should be coupled with even state subsidy of delivery because, for example, the economist Julian Simon showed that because every person is born with a brain and two hands, usually at least, greater population actually creates more economic growth. So actually, all of us have an interest in more and more babies being born, not aborted. And in America, how many millions and millions of abortions have we had since it was legalized? So I'm not pro-abortion. I am pro-choice. But I also add to that as strong a provision that we should do as much to promote delivery as we would do to promote making safe abortion available to pregnant women.
Do you cut off legality at 3 months?
Would I place it at 3 months?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I haven't studied pregnancy enough to know when. I don't think a baby can thrive at 3 months, but some preemies have thrived after 6 months in the mother, and then 3 months as a premature birth.
As president, would you push for a policy?
Of what?
A policy that would stop any abortion after 3 months.
No. I would promote a policy where the biologists and the medical ethicists, the physicians, the obstetricians, gynecologists, and so forth would advise us when the baby can usually thrive after being in the mother. But for the period when the baby would not thrive, if, for example, delivered by the mother prematurely, that's clearly a biological process going on in that woman's body. And I believe that as a human right, women should be allowed to choose abortion to end a pregnancy while the baby's life, the fetus's life, is still dependent on their body, namely the mother's body. But I wouldn't take the stark pro-abortion position of the feminists and the pro-choice community, where they don't even talk about funding services to women so that they can bring their babies to term. I think birth benefits the entire society, and I also think that ultimately every abortion that's done except to save the life of the mother is a tragedy. It's a loss of a human life. Who among us would choose it? But I don't think, as somebody raised in the Roman Catholic faith, I don't take the Roman Catholic position that abortion should be outlawed, because I recognize that the woman has a civil right to the sovereignty over her own body. Because before the baby can thrive outside of her body, pregnancy is a biological phenomenon going on in her body. And what's going on inside of her, the growth of that fetus is not yet a person. It hasn't been born. It hasn't been named. It's not breathing outside of the placentia and the amniotic fluid and so forth. So really, before the baby can be delivered and thrive as a newborn, a pregnancy is a biological phenomenon going on in the body of the woman. And I think men tend to overlook that when they take the anti-abortion position, the pro-life position. Let me also add as a caveat to my abortion position that I would also support as president a plebiscite among American women eligible to vote on abortion. Because at the end of the day, only women get pregnant. I find it officious and offensive that men would deign to tell women what to do with their bodies. And since pregnancy is a female biological condition, I would favor a plebiscite, a public vote, where American women could weigh in on abortion and see if they would endorse Roe v. Wade, for example, which was a Supreme Court decision, not the will of American women. But in this area, I would favor eliminating the franchise for men and upholding the franchise for women to vote on abortion.
Well, I mean, I think what you've said is fairly clear about it, but I just want to, just one last thing of like, it seems clear that you are pro-choice with various like personal caveats, but
right.
Would you, as president, intend to change anything about the existing abortion laws?
No, but I would sponsor government policies to, for example, make funding available for women to bring their pregnancies to term.
You would support additional services on top of the ones that we have.
I would support additional services that would be pro-life oriented rather than pro-choice.
And no restrictions on the current.
I would not curtail current abortion law. I would supplement it, however, with more pro-life oriented provisions, such as funding that would enable women to bring their pregnancies to term.
I think that's clear. All right. I still have a lot of questions, and I've got about half an hour. Is there any way you could talk further tomorrow after that half hour?
Sure. Let's go along. I love talking. I'm a talker, but also and a storyteller. But also, I think that you're really being diligent. I really want to validate that and work with you.
Well,
let me add one additional. Let me add one additional caveat on abortion. And this is a political point, and that's all it is, because I do admire the Honorable Ron Paul of Texas. Ron Paul has been very honorable during his political career in upholding the sovereignty principle, that government should never infringe the sovereignty of American citizens, except in this area. His pro-life position on abortion as an obstetrician who's delivered, pediatrician, he's delivered like 4,000 babies he did during his medical career. The problem is a sovereignty. It's an infringement of sovereignty to tell a woman what to do with her body before the baby can thrive outside her body. And Ron Paul knows that, but he's still crafted an exception to his very admirable personal sovereignty career. And I just would note that as a political point.
You would note that you take issue with that point?
Say again?
You would note that you take issue with that point?
I don't take issue with that point because Ron Paul was free to run for president and uphold what he thought was right, and I admire him. I'm just saying that philosophically and also in practical political terms, I don't want to repeat that example of a departure from principle.
I understand.
And I also think that I think if you do that, if you say, look, I embody, the defense of sovereignty, but then you take a pro-life position, you're basically telling more than half the population, the part of the population that's female, what to do with their physical sovereignty, that they don't have physical sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, in other words, I'm faulting Ron Paul not for being a fine American and a very idealistic and kind and intelligent man, which he certainly is. I'm just faulting the fact that it was philosophically and politically inconsistent for him to take that position. And sovereignty is sovereignty. It also includes, if we're sovereign, for example, not to be attacked physically, or not to be sexually assaulted, or not to have our reputations damaged, and these things that we say are part of our humanity, then it certainly has to include a woman's sovereignty over a biological process going on in her body. And he didn't take that position. I think he made a philosophical and a political error by not taking my position, which is that ultimately abortion has to be allowed to defend the physical sovereignty of pregnant women, but that at the same time, the fact that it's a medical and social and human tragedy has to also be recognized, and therefore we have to do everything in our power to discourage it and make the delivery of babies, the birth of human beings, as possible, as much as possible. Possible as much as possible. To encourage birth, not abortion.
I think that's clear.
That's my position.
Okay. So we've got that. All right. More controversial. Well, I don't know. You don't get much more controversial than abortion. Vaccination. All right. You want to ensure people's rights to refuse vaccination.
Right.
And you frame that as an issue of personal liberty. But how do you respond to the idea that vaccination is only truly effective if it's implemented across the board?
I don't believe that there's medical agreement on that. And I would also add that, look, that's somewhat of a facetious position by those advocating mass vaccination, and I'll tell you why. Conventionally, across most areas of disease, the American people have been sold by the medical community and by our political leaders that you, the individual, have to get vaccinated to protect yourself from a particular epidemic disease, that you have to get vaccinated. It has never really been a medical or a political medical argument that some kind of contagion effect may result only because a significant group of people are not getting vaccinated. In other words, and all of us would agree that if vaccination prevents somebody from getting a disease, that clearly the non-vaccinated can infect the non-vaccinated. But nobody has ever argued that unless everybody gets vaccinated, the entire society will perish or is at risk of getting infected, whatever the epidemic is. Okay, so my position basically is based on the prevailing medical opinion as has been expressed through public policy since the polio vaccine, which is that the individual needs to get vaccinated if they want to protect themselves from a particular malady. Okay. Now, if that's the case, as an extension of that abiding, that multi-decade, 70 or 80-year-old doctrine, my position is that if it's all ultimately comes down to individual vaccination, then those who are choosing vaccination can protect themselves, and those who don't want to choose vaccination, that is, avowedly and willfully choose vaccination, will not be protected, and they will run the risk of being infected. They will also run the risk of infecting others. And I think that's a position, let's say, of why Jerry Brown in California, the governor of California, forced through that bill requiring mandatory vaccination. Because while it was clear that some choose to be vaccinated, some object and decline vaccination based on their belief that it's more harmful than good, I think as a matter of public policy, the Brown administration was saying, yes, but we're public servants. We're the servants of the public's interest. We have to require everybody to get vaccinated to protect the non-vaccinated from the non-vaccinated. I simply I'm reading the other side of that coin. I'm saying, no, we have to make vaccination universally available and more than adequately publicized. And we have to achieve outreach to every community that would wish to be vaccinated. In every community, we have to reach every individual who would wish to be vaccinated. But we shouldn't try to protect either the vaccinated or the non-vaccinated from the non-vaccinated who choose not to vaccinate, because then that infringes on the right of individuals to decline vaccination, and it violates medical ethics because it requires them to undergo a medical procedure that they do not approve of. That puts us on the slippery slope of, quite frankly, mandatory medical treatment and even euthanasia. And that's why I object to it as a public policy choice. I mean, I'm factually recognizing that if you don't require mandatory vaccination, that the non-vaccinated can infect the non-vaccinated, and that group in society, or those two groups, would include those willfully not vaccinating and just the ignorant or the lazy who don't either don't know they should get vaccinated because they haven't learned, or the message hasn't reached them, or they haven't been attentive to what their medical needs are. But I don't believe that the proper choice is to say, okay, because the non-vaccinated might infect the non-vaccinated, therefore we should infringe on the rights of individuals and require them to be vaccinated. That's a violation of personal sovereignty, medical ethics, and of liberty, the liberty interest of the individual, not to undergo a forced or mandatory medical procedure. The solution, I would take the soft position. The solution to protecting the non-vaccinated from the non-vaccinated is public relations. It's publicity. It's not mandatory vaccination. And let me also add this, that was not debated in California when mandatory vaccination was passed. Mandatory vaccination, if done effectively or with complete efficiency, puts the entire population at potentially dying from a bad vaccine or a disease that's related to the supposedly, unlively, inoculated culture for that particular germ or that particular virus or bacteria plasma. In other words, just like if everybody started going on the same diet and you had 100 people drinking some new kind of milkshake or something, and it destroyed everybody's livers, you'd have a mass die-off of the population, and society would collapse. So by a similar analogy, we should not adopt mandatory vaccination, because if there's something wrong with the vaccine, we're going to be killing everybody in society. Instead, just as people choose to marry and procreate very close to their ethnicity, very far away, and in ranges in between, we should allow the same kind of choice-making in the area of vaccination. By the way, I use that example because some people are endogenous, some are exogenous, and some people are in between. And what that does is it optimizes genetic diversity, but it also protects certain bloodlines from epidemic blood-related or genetic diseases from entering their community. Okay, so actually a kind of an island archipelago-like approach to mating and dating, dating and mating, protects us from genetic disease. You have populations that are not mixing, but then you're respecting people's right to supposedly what used to be called miscegenate and intermarry somebody of another race, another ethnicity, etc. That's the most beneficial profile for procreation because it shares positive genetic traits, but it ultimately inoculates or indemnifies the entire population from a collapse based on some genetic characteristic being amplified or broadcast through the entire population. Same thing with vaccinations. You don't want to require mandatory vaccinations because in the event of some problem with the vaccine, you could have a large die-off of population, and the economic and social fallout of that could be catastrophic. So I think we should allow that vocal minority of people who don't want to be vaccinated to learn what the vaccine is purported to achieve, but then refuse it. At the same time, we should strive to make those unaware of the existence of the vaccine aware so they can choose to be vaccinated if they want to. In other words, we shouldn't allow anybody to die or get sick because the message of getting the vaccine didn't reach them because they were poor or lived in the inner city or were not literate. And so we should use television and the internet and so forth to, YouTube and other channels, mainstream television, to reach people about particular vaccines, but then make it voluntary. That, I think, is the most sensible approach, and the one that's consistent with both biomedical ethics and the biological interests of society.
All right, we're gonna have to come back to that one. Like, I gotta re-listen to your response.
Okay.
Okay. I will come back to it. And
Okay.
I mean, it's not that I felt like there were, I had a particular issue.
Well, see, the key, yeah, right. The key is
I lost
those
the
who wish to
thread.
get vaccinated can't get vaccinated. So what's the problem?
What's that?
And then if you reach those who don't get if there's a certain minority in the population, for whatever reason, they might be serving overseas or, smoking too much grass or whatever. They're in college and they're focusing on their studies and not being aware that there's a really severe strain of influenza that they should get vaccinated against.
Right.
If you're both reaching everybody who would want to get vaccinated and allowing everybody who wants to get vaccinated, then theoretically everybody who wants to get vaccinated is being reached and is getting vaccinated. At that point, after getting vaccinated, if the medical justification for their vaccination is valid, then they've been protected. What's the problem? Why then force it on those who don't want to get vaccinated?
Well, I mean,
we don't force people to get on the same elevator with us, right?
Well, I don't personally hold a strong stance on this one aside, but I will say that the idea of personal liberty doesn't necessarily apply to children who aren't allowed to make that decision for themselves.
Well, but see, that goes to the doctrine of parens patriae and whether parents, like let's say the Amish or Mennonites, should be allowed to prevent their children from getting inoculated from polio and rubella and pertussis and tetanus and so forth. That's the discrete issue of parental choice making relative to the biomedical prospects of their progeny. That's a separate issue, and I don't even want to go there. That's I think a civil rights issue that the Supreme Court has already addressed. And then the question becomes: do you allow society or the parents to make that decision? I think there are colorable claims on either side of that issue. I'm just saying among adult Americans, I think that if we're going to have personal sovereignty, it has to involve the right to listen to somebody advising that we do something medically and choose not to do that thing. Because if we don't do it in the area of vaccinations, we could theoretically at least, or even practically, require people to, lose weight or be fined. Come on. You can't force, it violates ethics to force somebody to undergo a medical procedure. It's as simple as that. And the lives and health of the vaccinated is not dependent on the lives and health of the non-vaccinated. And to make that argument is to purport something in epidemiology that I don't think has been substantiated. And that is, if the vaccine works, you should be able to protect yourself from the epidemic, right? Nobody is saying if a critical mass is non-vaccinated, that somehow this virus is going to mutate or something because so many people are carrying the virus. Nobody has said that. So the question, if the question is one of medical protection by vaccinating, then my counter argument to the mandatory vaccination camp is, well, the vaccinated are protected, right? Why should they then force such protection on those who don't want to be protected?
Well, I mean, again, I think the biggest issue usually comes down to children, but you see that as a separate legal issue.
I see them as two issues, but also, there are many adults who do not vaccinate. I don't vaccinate, for example, against influenza.
Right. But I mean,
if I have the flu, I'm sick for a couple of days, I shit my brains out, I throw up, I have a temperature.
Have you been vaccinated for polio?
I have a fever, it kills the virus, I'm done.
Have you been vaccinated for polio?
No, I think there's two issues. One is the rights of adults to choose for themselves whether they're going to have a medical procedure imposed on themselves that isn't required to save or protect other people's lives. The others can get vaccinated. Mm-hmm. The second issue is the doctrine of whether the state or the parent should have the medical decision-making authority to either vaccinate or not vaccinate a child. And that's a separate, discrete issue because it goes to the inchoate liberty interests of the child. Two separate issues.
So how far does that go? Because, we make lots of decisions for parents. And those decisions essentially are done.
I'll give you an answer. You know how far it goes? I believe that the state should intervene, let's say, in parental decision making over the life of a child when the parents are clearly wrong. So, for example, somebody, because of their religious beliefs, doesn't want to allow their child's appendicitis to be treated by a removal of an organ, removal of the diseased appendix. The state, operating on the basis of parens patriae, should be able to intervene, supervene the parent's medical authority, and say, no, parent, well, we're not going to tell you how to raise your child. You don't have the right to kill your child by getting them a life-saving appendectomy, okay? But where there's medical confusion, and for example, there's a set of equities involved, countervailing equities, like vaccination, the lifesaver, and then vaccination, the autism causer, or vaccination, the causer of paralysis or of seizure disorders. In other words, where there's a colorable claim, at least, that a medical debate exists, I believe that the authority should be with the parent. Because, look, the state can't tell the parent what the medical truth is. And all they're doing is forcing the hand of the parent, saying, we're going to require that your child be vaccinated. I would only require the vaccination where there was no argument. And by the way, that might also be, we might medically find out that some vaccines are effective and some just involve incurring the risk of side effects without any efficacy. So I think it's a complex issue, but I would only supervene the authority of the parent to make medical decisions for their child where the discrete decision they're making would cause, death or serious bodily injury to the child. In other words, where we know the parent is wrong. But we don't know in the area of vaccination. It's still disputed whether or not vaccinations are effective. So, in the case of a child dying of septic shock from a diseased appendix, that would medically always indicate getting an appendectomy. The parents would not be restricting or failing to provide medical care to their child on the basis of doubt existing. They would be making that decision in the absence of doubt, which would be tantamount to first-degree murder. Okay, it would be a negligent homicide to allow a child dying of septic shock from a diseased appendix not to get swollen appendix, not to get an appendectomy. That is not the case, however, in the area of vaccines, because it is medically disputed as to whether or not they're effective. And it is also medically disputed, it's not medically disputed that occasionally they'll cause death, paralysis, seizure disorders, mental retardation, and so forth. It is medically disputed as to whether or not they cause autism.
I don't think that it's medically disputed that, polio has virtually disappeared.
Well, that's a pro-argument that's not responsive to the philosophical and legal argument that I framed. I never said that.
I'm sorry.
We haven't been
just one second.
eliminating some diseases. I haven't said that we haven't been effective at limiting some diseases.
Well, you said that there's no proof that it is effective, that vaccinations work.
No, that's not what I said. It hasn't been proven that all vaccines are effective.
Well, I don't think that anybody's trying to say that all vaccines are effective.
No, I'm saying that it hasn't been proven, for example, it hasn't been proven that all vaccines are effective. So you really have to engage in a case-by-case analysis. And that would be an epidemiological process that would be placed before a state legislature, not a governor operating by divine right of kings, as it were. But you would put as it was in California, it was placed before the California legislature, and they basically reached the conclusion that vaccination is always good because some vaccines have eliminated some diseases. Well, that's not a brief for the notion that all vaccines are advisable. It just means there have been some medical success stories with vaccination.
Well, what about,
I should add, maybe polio disappeared not because of vaccination, but because of improved birth weights and nutrition, neonatal and childhood nutrition after World War II. My dad and his generation, a lot of them were skinny GIs. My dad was eating apple butter and toast for 2 meals a day during the Depression as a 10-year-old. So when he went into World War II in 1943, into the Army during World War II, he was 130 pounds at age 19. I have his records, okay? So we forget the fact that when the vaccination age began, so did the outbreak in economic prosperity that increased things like nutritional food consumption for children and adolescents and everybody in society. So you could frame an argument that some of these epidemic diseases have disappeared because society has become more prosperous and more efficient at providing life support for the average person. Again, is it correlation or is it causation? The epidemiologists who support vaccination would say it's causation. We've wiped out polio. But those who oppose the logic of vaccination as medically unproved would say, no, we eliminated child hunger, or almost did, and therefore people have been more physically fit to fight viral infection. So it's a complicated issue. All I'm saying is I would only allow the state to mandate what parents do when the parent's decision is literally and is known without question to be ill-advised and the foolish, life-threatening thing to do or to allow.
All I'll ask beyond that, and like don't believe that I'm like I mean, as you say, it's a complicated issue, but I have to wrap up, and I will say, or just ask, at what point do you accept medical opinion on this issue? Like 80% of scientists responding say this, 50, 60.
Well, they've been wrong about a lot of other things. I don't believe right now, my bottom line position is I believe that there's a legitimate argument as to whether or not vaccines are effective. I don't know, but it's my sense as an intelligent, educated human being that the notion that vaccinations are effective may have been sold to us and not be true, and still be something that 80% of doctors or epidemiologists, virologists, or whatever would endorse as the truth. I know from my own experiences defending some very controversial truths that most people are not scientific, and the proverbial way of expressing this, I like to say, most people frame their findings based on their beliefs, not their beliefs based on their findings. Okay, so most people who believe that vaccinations work are deductively reasoning based on, I was told vaccines are effective, therefore I will get vaccinated because they are effective. They're not saying, well, let's take a look at vaccinations and see what else could have caused the elimination of these diseases, for example. Mm-hmm. And they don't analyze the efficacy of vaccinations in arriving at their position that's pro-vaccination for themselves or pro-mandatory vaccination for society. And I've debated my time travel claims, which are true claims. I mean, the United States government has had trillions of dollars to spend on time travel and many other exotic technologies in the past 70 years. It's had the brightest physicists and the most talented electrical engineers in the country to work with. It's had virtually the entire state of New Mexico to use as a laboratory, okay, with very little social or public or governmental scrutiny, okay? I know, debating my time travel experiences on Facebook, for example, where my time travel group has over 15,000 members, which I've done since 2009. That's been 7 years of argumentation. I've probably defended my experiences at least, 500 times now, okay? Mm-hmm. Maybe, at least 100 or several hundred times, okay? I know that most people are not scientific. They basically possess a belief, therefore that belief colors their findings. They don't look at the findings and then derive their beliefs inductively. So because of this propensity in society to be deductive in our thinking, to reason from a precept into our scrutiny of the facts, of reality, I am very suspicious that those who are now saying, I very much suspect that those who are now saying that vaccines are not effective may very well be right, notwithstanding the fact that they make up only, let's say, 20% of the adult population.
And that suspicion carries over into your sincerely held beliefs about personal liberty.
About liberty, not about epidemiology. I mean, I have gotten the RPT shot. I was going to go to India when I was a student at Cambridge in 1994-95, and I got a range of shots, I think, from malaria, cholera, typhus, tetanus. Okay, so I am a vaccinator personally, but as a public servant, I don't want to force what I think is medically appropriate for me on somebody who is medically opposed to that medical procedure, because my life and health and the life and health of other vaccinating people does not depend on that non-vaccinator getting vaccinated. I think the only public health issue here is, are we reaching everybody with the message to get vaccinated? Because we don't want to cheat somebody who would theoretically choose vaccination to not get vaccinated in the same way that those who avowedly don't want to get vaccinated decline to be vaccinated. At the same time, I don't think there's any medical reason that's been proven to me, no kind of critical mass contagion effect like argument, that if everybody doesn't get vaccinated, the non-vaccinated will infect the vaccinated. That's never been argued. It's always been argued that by getting vaccinated, you're immune from getting that disease spread to you. Okay, well, if that's the case, then I don't think there's a medical argument to invade the liberty interests of those who don't want that medical procedure. In other words, my argument is my position on this, Rhett, is it's nuanced and it's complex. It's not based on some kind of new age or far right-wing belief that vaccination is a plot and that it's known that they don't work, etc. It's just based on a weighing of the medical equities involved against the legal and philosophical equities involved.
I understand. Yeah, I do. I mean, I understand. So, I'm sorry I gotta cut this off. I have to be somewhere else in 20 minutes. But yeah, can you talk tomorrow, Sunday?
Yeah. Where are you? Are you in LA by any chance, or New York, or where are you?
I'm in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I read that on your Facebook. My mom, I thought you might have been out in LA with somebody, but my mom grew up in Brooklyn.
Oh yeah.
I used to go into Brooklyn as a kid growing up in New Jersey to visit my grandparents. They lived in a brownstone on Flatbush Avenue.
Ah, yeah. I know Flatbush
Avenue. My mom went to PS9 in Brooklyn, and 40 years after she left elementary school, we saw that 60 Minutes investigation of PS9 where the principal spilled the knives and shivs that the kids had brought to school on his desktop. And that was literally her elementary school. But I'm really familiar with Brooklyn growing up.
You're in North Carolina, right?
Yeah, I live in Washington State, but I'm temporarily here in North Carolina because my campaign headquarters are here.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just temporarily here. Yeah.
Well, I'm from South Carolina.
So you're in Eastern time. What about 1 o'clock tomorrow? Would that work for you?
Yeah, 1 o'clock's great.
Cool. I'd love discussing, as long as you want, to do a good piece. Because I have, I am a deep thinker, and I do want my ideas, disseminated via this presidential campaign. And I was originally in it, believing I could win or maybe get the Democratic nomination. But the bottom line for me for running for president has just been the tremendous cost. If you're not a mainstream candidate with huge financial reserves, it's almost impossible to become president. And that's something I think we should take a hard look at. And I'd be happy to talk about that tomorrow. I think we should have kind of an internet-driven introduction of the candidate. In other words, there would be like a League of Women Voters type structuring of the candidacy so that they're more fair.
I'm happy to talk about anything that is not Donald Trump's hands, or like whether Ted Cruz's wife isn't as attractive as his. I don't know. I'm happy to talk about it. But yeah, so I'll give you a call.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
I'll give you a call at 1 tomorrow.
Sounds great, man. Have a good night.
Hey, you too. Thanks, Andy.
Okay, take care, Red. You got it.
Yeah. All right, we're rolling. So, where did we leave off? We left off, we were on vaccination last.
Right.
Let's do something. One thing that I've found interesting is, I guess it's not a new idea to do stuff like economic boycotts, but you want to be specific in hitting various, moral practices. Like you use the example of Japan's killing of dolphins. You would like to see an economic boycott in order to change that. Like, what are some other examples of what you would like to target with boycotts?
Well, I'd like to ban the death penalty in the United States for a host of reasons. I mean, a myriad of reasons that are pretty complex to narrate right now. But if we did, I think we should hit China on the grounds that it uses the death penalty, and it uses it gratuitously, it uses it excessively. And they even have execution vans in China. And I think that's extremely inhumane. So that's one that comes to mind. I think the overarching purpose of that proposal is that, corporations are sort of the fourth branch of government. They're sort of an area of unregulated power, which is kind of the argument that's made in books like David Corton's When Corporations Ruled the World, which I know Ralph Nader praised, and I agree. And the thing about boycotts and why they should be used more is that the moral universe should take precedence over the economic universe. And that's obviously that's what's behind my call to end slavery. There are 27 million slaves in the world, or at least quasi-slaves, and some are slaves per se. So we're not doing that. We're elevating the significance of the global economy above morality. And when human societies have done that, like in the slaveocracy in the American South, disaster follows, and mass abrogation of the rights of human beings follows. So I just think we should be more willing in specific cases. Another example would be Saudi oil. I mean, look at the public executions of women who have been denied due process. Now, unlike China, most of those decapitations by the Saudi regime are for first-degree murder, but some are not. And that would be another example. I think we should be willing to lead the world morally and use economic boycotts to discipline the behavior of nation states, and be willing to accept boycotts against us when we stray. We're just not doing that. And it's a travesty because it suggests that the interests of the global economy take precedence over human rights, and I don't believe that's the case. I admire President Carter. People are very critical of President Carter as if his presidency was a failure, but on keeping us out of war and on human rights, his presidency was a great success. He was trying to utilize government to perfect the moral order, and that's what I think we should be about as a country.
So you bring up the corporations as this sort of fourth government, and lately it's been interesting to see that work in a good way, maybe the way that like various corporations have stepped up to pressure North Carolina on their LGBT laws.
That's an example. I mean, the anti-LGBT statute in North Carolina was based on bigotry and on discrimination, And there's an example: New York State. Governor Cuomo in New York State stopped, letting contracts to North Carolina. Bruce Springsteen refused to perform here. Mm-hmm. It's a perfect example. Why not do that? And the other thing is, kind of on a game theory basis, there's kind of a you get a race to the top, because if all nations are willing to impose economic boycotts for moral reasons, and some of the most powerful nation states with the biggest markets, like the United States of America, do so, then unlike labor and environmental standards, falling to the bottom, racing to the bottom, like under NAFTA, with economic boycotts, you get a race to the top. You have all nation states capable of closing their market to the economic entities or consumers of another country because of their behavior. And that's a powerful instrument to bring about the moral perfection of society.
But so on that same note, another thing you want to do is democratize transnational corporations. And yeah, I mean, I guess just tell us what that, what you mean.
Well, I actually just should put corporations. I didn't. I mean, it's not really essential that they be transnational. They could just be operating within the United States. I just meant that we should, because corporate leadership, corporate governance represents a non-constitutionally delegated form of power. So, for example, a corporate employer can tell you who you're romantically involved with. A corporation can tell you what the goods that are going to be reasonably available in your community are going to be, like if a Walmart comes in. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I simply mean that because this form of non-delegated, basically unconstitutional power exists, we should find creative ways to democratize the corporations and their impacts on their employees first, and then the community. So, for example, requiring employee stock ownership plans rather than just allowing them for corporations over a certain size is an example of that. You're saying, if this corporation gets so big and has such an employee base that it should begin to become a quasi-public institution in limited ways. I'm not against the profit motive. Mm-hmm. And I do believe the business of America is business. I'm pro-corporate in the sense, like Obama was when we had the argument in 1983, in the sense that corporate organization is a necessary form of social organization to limit liability and to allow large economic activities to be undertaken effectively. I just mean that because they're so pervasive in how they affect our lives, that we should ask for ways of how to democratize them. So, for example, the media conglomerates that rule television, I would require a portion of mainstream commercial programming to be determined by the consumer, by the viewer, rather than having everything pushed at the viewing public. Requiring ESOPs for corporations over a certain number of employees and a certain size, that's another example. I'm sure there are many others that we can think of, but that's basically the spirit of that. I don't mean that we should impose socialism on the corporations, because socialism, quite frankly, does not work because there's no money in it. I'm a Cambridge economist, and I'm not a socialist of the Bernie Sanders ilk, or even farther left of that. I'm not a Swedish socialist, a British socialist. I'm a democratic capitalist. My concern is that, there were four political economies that were at war for supremacy during the 20th century. Basically, the two that espoused authoritarian government, fascism and communism, and the two that did not, socialism and democratic capitalism. And then you can distinguish fascism from communism in the sense that fascism espouses the private collectivization of property, while communism espouses public property. And then among the non-authoritarian political economies, socialism espouses public ownership of property, and democratic capitalism espouses private ownership of property. I believe in the traditional American political economy, which sought to combine non-authoritarian government, or government by the consent of the governed, with the private ownership of property. I believe that's the superior model of political organization. That's what we embodied as a country. But the problem is that because we retained the private ownership of property and allowed basically a widely disparate set of economic outcomes among citizens, economic players, however you want to define them, as we began to move towards authoritarian government embodied in things like the Patriot Act, we began to move from democratic capitalism towards fascism. That should alarm all of us. So because that's been going on, if we begin to focus on democratizing the corporations, then we pull the United States back from becoming a fascist society. A fascist society would be characterized by authoritarian, non-consensual government. And I don't think anybody can argue that aspects of a police state are forming in the United States. So it combines, fascism combines authoritarian government with private ownership of property. So if we don't democratize the corporations, we're inevitably going to transition from democratic capitalism towards fascism. I don't think trying to find ways to democratize the corporations are, Gary Hart, new idea kind of idealism. I don't think somebody's an Atari Democrat if they espouse, if they recognize that the corporations do embody a form of government that's not regulated and that we're not attempting to democratize, that we are moving towards authoritarian government. So I think the attempt to democratize the corporations is the effective way by which we pull back our destiny as a country and begin to again espouse democratic capitalism. So I don't believe in a confiscatory income tax. I just believe that on the margin we should try to democratize the corporations as much as possible.
So, to go back to your example about television, how would you theoretically see, content chosen by the people?
Well, I would transition them to falling somewhere between commercial and public television. I would recognize, since they have their capital at risk when they decide, to put a sports game on rather than a concert, that they're the economic stakeholder for those investments in what's on the air. But that a portion of their programming should be determined by, let's say, a citizens committee of maybe learned musicians and artists and professors and so forth. Because look, if television is prevalent, if it's the prevalent form of mainstream media, I guess YouTube is starting to overtake commercial television, but still, commercial television is watched by hundreds of millions of Americans, so fairly regularly. So I would just have a kind of a public television-driven citizens committee so that a certain amount of programming would be allocated towards higher culture, like maybe 10% of their program. So everything's not, silly cartoons, crass, soap operas and comedies and sports games. And that's what we're getting. So, for example, I'm concerned that American school children are, even into their adolescence, are watching a lot of sort of higher-end cartoons. As the kids are aging, they're no longer watching Scooby-Doo, but they're watching, I forgot the name of it. Let me think of this example. Gravity Falls and those kind of, wacky, higher-end cartoons that the parents can also watch and laugh at the double entendres and the esoteric jokes that they're now embedding into those cartoons. And I think it's fine for popular culture to evolve like that. But are the kids watching movie classics? Are they watching 12 Angry Men, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Caine Mutiny, and classic feature films with moral content, Saving Private Ryan? I don't think they are. I think our common culture is being debased by inferior cultural content, and one of the main delivery mechanisms of that inferior culture is television. So I would have a citizens committee of learned, talented people who would select that 10% of the programming. So it might be a Johnny Mathis concert. It might be a classic film. In other words, you'd have, because one thing I know about media, having lived in LA and having known people in media from different art forms. Like we had a neighbor who had done everything in music, from play saxophone in Kay Kaiser's big band to record produce Barbra Streisand. He did everything in music, Warren Vincent. And what I learned from Warren is that the claim that media conglomerates give the people what they want based on popularity is not true. They actually determine the market. In other words, they determine what they're going to market, and then they sell it. It's not a meritocratic or a plebeian system where record sales govern the records that are produced. The record producers govern the records that are produced based on trending to some extent, but also just on production selection of particular bands and instrumentalists and singers and so forth. And then they market. So we haven't recognized this as a society, that media selection is not governed by populist forces. It's governed by corporate forces. The corporations are determining what to market to us. So, if they learn that, Colby Calais got 37 million downloads of her song Bubbly on MySpace, yeah, she's going to get a recording contract. But, so is another group if they think that group is making music in a trendy area of music. It's not the buyership of the people that determines who's produced, let's say, in the record industry. It's the calculations that are made by the A&R people for the record companies. Mm. And it's a spurious concept that we live in, a plebeian democracy where the consumers of mainstream media content determine it. They don't.
Yeah.
The production companies do, and therefore, if we don't include community input, everything gets debased by investment decisions rather than cultural decisions. And I don't think that's in our interest as a society. So,
yeah, I mean, that's
and
good.
Nobody ever says it because as long as they continue to give people a couple things that they become fans of, like, I don't know, The Simpsons or something, the population never really gets this. The American people have never really gotten this, and they remain sort of placated. Mm-hmm. And they think they're being given what they're buying, but actually they're buying what they're being given. That's my position.
So related topic of just like mediums, the platforms. Like you want a court to be established that would only deal with cases involving the internet. So how would this court system work differently than the one we have?
It would just be a specialized court, just like the bankruptcy courts and tax courts and admiralty courts and so forth. It would, excuse me. It would say the internet is becoming literally the domain of global civilization. It's becoming the agora, the meeting place of society on many, many levels. So it would say that the things that go on the internet are so ubiquitous and so dominant that it's difficult for a person who's active on the internet to really even police the internet. So, for example, I'm very active on the internet. I utilize it in my law practice. I use it to communicate personally. I founded and maintain a number of groups, actively maintain a number of groups on Facebook. I'm going to clean up Twitter and get my own actual name on Twitter and start tweeting in my campaign and so forth. Uh-huh. And what I found being online is it's difficult for the individual to interact with the internet or be featured on the internet and really preserve his or her legal rights. I mean, because it's there's so much content that virtually everybody during their career on the internet is subject to defamation of character, copyright infringement, false light publicity, stalking, and so forth. So I would just, in the interest of judicial economy, I would simply say, let's found an internet court that only deals with internet matters. And as a federal court system, those magistrates could also specialize on issuing the warrants for government searches of people online. because that's another area where you could potentially have your rights infringed if, let's say, your email traffic is being eavesdropped by the National Security Agency. I don't think that any of our alphabet intelligence agencies or criminal, prosecutorial, or regulatory agencies should necessarily be denied the capacity to surveil somebody online if they are enforcing the criminal code or the administrative code. I just think that we should comport with the Bill of Rights under the Fourth Amendment and make those warranted searches. In other words, a lawful magistrate should issue a warrant to permit the infringement of that person's privacy. Okay, so I would do everything from have that court do that, issue the warrants to do surreptitious searches of people's internet traffic, but also protect the rights of individual Americans and consumers by, it would be the place where you would file a standard form for defamation and the court would shut down the defamatory content. In other words, see, the problem is the internet emerged as a Defense Department communications network, and then it emerged in a highly privatized commercial context, and essentially it's the Wild Wild West. It's a place where regularly people get defamed. For example, I'm a public figure, but I'm also an attorney at law privately and a human being. And right now, an individual named Tory Smith is falsely alleging in a YouTube that I have raped and killed 111 children. I mean, that's so ridiculous. It's asinine, yes, and most people won't believe it. But some people will, and I will be actively defamed. I'll even be defamed subtly, even among the people who don't believe that wild, impossible claim, because it just leaves the odor of a crime involving moral turpitude. Now, I've lived a Christic life. I've lived a good life where I've done right by other people. I was raised that way. So I've never harmed anybody else, and I've never violated the criminal code. And yet here I'm being accused of a mass atrocity. That's possible because I'm so busy and the internet is so active that it's impossible to just simply police defamation of character. What am I supposed to do? Sue everybody who makes a false allegation like that against me? I couldn't even get the FBI to investigate and shut down 7 people who were stalking me at the same time in 2011. Red, I was being stalked physically by 7 people. Well, at least I was being stalked remotely by 7 people. And one of those persons moved from Sacramento to Portland, Oregon to physically stalk me. And when I contacted the FBI, all they did is put me in touch with an FBI webpage about how to file a claim with the government in the event of economic fraud online. It was complete non sequitur. They didn't say, well, sir, you have a right not to be stalked online or physically stalked by somebody using the internet to try to communicate with you, to try to find out where you live. They didn't do anything for me. So what I would do is I would have a board of internet scholars work with the Justice Department, the U.S. Justice Department, in determining everything that's going on online that is criminal or tortious. And then a set of standard forms would be evolved so everybody could file regarding that conduct. And then that would be a way of policing the internet so that the public is protected, but also individuals are protected. I mean, because there's defamation, copyright infringement, stalking.
That would definitely be a pretty heavy bureaucratic load, huh?
It would, but because the internet is now the commonplace. I'll use the Greek term agora. It's the marketplace where people go and gab. It's the most common arena of social intercourse and discourse, of communication and contact. Mm-hmm. It has to be made consistent with the notion of a good society, and it isn't. It's a cesspool of defamation, stalking, criminal activity, in terms of marketing things illegally, false light publicity, copyright infringement. I mean, look at a website like Scribd. They regularly take people's books and publish them without permission. Mm-hmm. Why haven't they been shut down by the government? That's mass copyright infringement. But we've accepted a lot of garbage. We've accepted a lot of diminishment of the legal standards that protect us from stalking, that protect us from copyright infringement, that protect us from defamation of character, and the other things that are going on online every day because of basically sort of the technological surprise of the technology. You know, it's like Einstein said that the problem with the nuclear arms race was that nuclear weapons had emerged before we developed a social organization to cope with them, and therefore we were in danger of mass annihilation. I think there's an analogy with the internet. The internet emerged so quickly and in such a pervasive way that we haven't made it a good domain of society. It's a lawless domain. And I would make it lawful by evolving an internet court in which a person could literally download and make, under penalty of perjury, make a discrete legal claim by just filling out the form and scanning it and sending it back to the internet court. And something like Tory Smith's totally bogus claim that I've killed 111 people would be taken down immediately, as per a government warrant. I mean, if he was in downtown New York City and shouting, Andrew DiBusciago has murdered 111 children after raping them, he could be arrested. I could have him arrested for criminal endangerment of me by people who might respond to that information and seek to kill me. Okay, so this is what we haven't done. And because the internet is such a cash cow, and because the potential to defame politicians is so rife on the internet, our government has avoided doing this, and it's been irresponsible. Every time regulation of the internet is suggested, there's this false claim made that the government is either going to tax or shut down the internet. What about policing it so that it's a good domain of society? Just like newspapers were disciplined. We moved away from yellow journalism as a society when we began enforcing the defamation laws, the libel laws. We're not even policing slander per se. In my home jurisdiction, the state of Washington, there are 4 forms of slander per se. And slander per se is where you don't have to prove damages to get damages. It's a strict liability kind of tort where just as a result of saying something, it's viewed to be inherently damaging and you can get monetary damages. And that's where the person alleges that you've committed a crime involving moral turpitude, you have a loathsome disease, the unchasteness of an unmarried woman. That's still on the books. In business or professional incompetence. Okay, so in Washington, you can just sue, and without even proving damages, you can get monetary damages if you can prove the fact pattern that the person said one of those things about you and it was false. Okay, if you have a loathsome disease like leprosy, you can't recover because it was true, and that's a defense to defamation because it obviates one of the necessary elements of defamation, that the statement be false. Okay, now we allow that in conventional contexts in the state of Washington, but we're not even. That just fell off. Yeah. We're not policing the internet by providing an effective way, in a convenient way, for somebody like me vis-a-vis Tory Smith to shut him down, to get an injunction, to have the content immediately removed. I mean, it's obvious that a 54-year-old lawyer who's never been arrested, I was only questioned by police once, and that was because somebody had filed a false claim against me. Okay, so I've never been arrested, I've never been charged, I've never been tried, and I've never been convicted of a crime. I'm 54. Okay, I'm going to be 55 in September in half a year. And this jerk is accusing me of 111 accounts. 111 counts of child rape and murder. I mean, where does it stop? It stops by the creation of an internet court where people have redress to immediately shut this kind of garbage down. Why don't we have that? The people haven't demanded it, and they should be. So as their president, I would introduce legislation to create an internet court for all internet-related actions. That way we steer everything that's related to online activity towards a court that can develop expertise in that area of the law.
Mm-hmm. Like,
let's say you're suing for copyright infringement. Hold on, let me get a drink. I've got a scratchy throat this morning.
Yeah, take your time.
Let's say you sue. Are you there?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, right. Let's say you sue under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act for an act of copyright infringement online, which carries statutory damages of $80,000. If we had an internet court, people pursuing copyright infringement actions under that act would be going before a court that practices that area of law all day long. So you wouldn't have to create a textual or a verbal argument before a federal district court judge or magistrate. You would go in front of basically a specialized court, and that judge would know right away whether you had a legitimate claim. If we had people being sued $80,000, even if there weren't recoveries, but $80,000 for every act of copyright infringement, people would be behaving the proper way, and that is not being engaged in copyright infringement online. But like I said, there are even entire websites like Scribd, Scribd, that regularly practice that. Mm. So that would be one of the benefits of an internet court, is that the judges on it and the lawyers practicing in front of it would be doing internet law all day long. In fact, after leaving the presidency, if I'm elected, I would practice that. I find that stuff fascinating. Internet law is a fascinating emergent area of the law. So there would be no shortage of lawyers who would want to practice before that court. But that would be one of the main benefits, would become a specialized court with specialized practitioners who would really know the law. Mm-hmm. And be able to give swift justice in, for example, enjoining and penalizing illegal conduct online.
Like, so I have a few more questions about technology, but I think it's best if we circle back to it after we talk about first. I mean, we've got to cover time travel, and aliens, of course. So
okay,
I specifically want to talk about your moonshot proposal with time travel, but we have to cover the basics of that in the first place. So, I mean, I know this is a long story, and it's, been the focus of your previous press.
Right.
So if you could just give us the bullet points of what you mean when you're talking about. So the first part is government disclosure of secret advanced technologies, particularly time travel. Like, what are these technologies being kept secret? Why?
Okay, I entered public life as a whistleblower. I began lecturing in 2004 about my childhood experiences in DARPA's Project Pegasus. DARPA had a program that was basically an intelligence funnel into which they were putting anything that would allow the U.S. government to derive a time travel capability. I think I mentioned yesterday that they were worried about the extraterrestrials that began visiting us with greater frequency after the advent of the atomic age, basically after 1944. What the former Soviet Union might do, its military, and now there's better evidence that there was a surviving Nazi contingent on Antarctica, and that's not folklore, but was actually something that the U.S. government was responding to. My father was brought into the response to whatever was above, whether they were Nazis or ETs, piloting those craft above Washington, D.C. in July of 1952, which was an alleged ET overflight. We now think it may have been Nazis demonstrating their technology, but that created an emergency within the United States government that President Eisenhower inherited when he was sworn in from Truman. And because those craft, and this is a matter of public record, that incident was reported on the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times in early July of '52. Those craft, whatever they were piloted by. Huh?
Is that available online? The front page.
Probably, yeah, probably. That was July 1952. So those are famous front pages. And so despite the giggle factor that TV news perpetuated for the next 50 years about ETs, whatever was piloting those crafts, whether it was a secret society, whether it was a surviving contingent of Nazis, whether they were extraterrestrials or ultra-terrestrials from within the Earth or wherever, it's undisputed that they were doing things that were then not within the technical capability of the United States government. And my dad knew that because after that event, he was brought in to design the metal alloy by which the ramjet planes would be built so that the fuselage and engines and so forth wouldn't melt when the ramjet, from friction with air molecules inside our atmosphere and friction or contact with space particles of space dust when the ramjet went outside our atmosphere. So my father was not an expert, but he was certainly an informed party about the fact that events like the July 1952 overflight of Washington involved technology that we had to catch up to, wherever it was coming from, off-planet, Soviet Union, surviving Nazis, whatever. Okay. It even could have been a secret society within this country.
What was your dad's position?
Say again?
What was your dad's position?
My dad was an electrical engineer who worked for a set of defense contractors. In 52 to 55, he was on the design team for the ramjet at Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company in Woodridge, New Jersey. He designed the metal alloy, or his team designed the metal alloy by which the ramjet would be built. He actually synthesized what alloy wouldn't melt. Okay, so from that point on, from the early 50s on, my dad was frequently attached to the aerospace projects that involved catching up with whatever faction had the superior technology. Presumably the extraterrestrials did because they were here from interstellar space, right? Mm-hmm. And there's, Michael Salla's new book, Dr. Michael Salla, S-A-L-L-A, pretty much establishes that there was a surviving Nazi contingent in Antarctica, and they had superior aircraft. Okay, so my dad spent his whole career in that realm, and sometime during his time when he was employed at the Thomas A. Edison Research Laboratory. That wasn't the historical Edison Labs in West Orange. It was actually located in a set of offices that was physically adjacent to the historical Edison Lab. In fact, it was only separated by the historical Edison Labs by one door. But anyway, it was a think tank begun in 1950. My dad was hired there in 1956. He worked there till 1964. And as later described to me in the presence of a Ralph M. Parsons Company engineer named Ray Kubik, who was my father's friend and supervisor at a number of these companies, my father was asked by the government to repeat Nikola Tesla's teleportation experiments when he was at the Edison Labs. So one day when we were playing upper pool at our house in New Jersey in 71, he described how he was magnetizing cylinders in the way that Tesla had been, and then he was dropping an object through the cylinder like a penny, a billiard chalk, and the object was coming out the other end either too fast, too slow, or not at all. And in fact, when I appeared on Coast to Coast and described this, somebody who grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, described how in 1956 he found a 1958 penny in the street, on the street in Montclair, New Jersey. And I wrote him back by email. I said, geez, that might have been one of the pennies that my dad dropped through one of the Tesla cylinders. Okay, so my dad basically, by the time that the Edison Labs closed in 1964, he was an expert on Tesla teleportation. When the Edison Labs closed, he was so angry that when he was telling our neighbors at a 4th of July picnic in 1964 or 5 that they were on the verge of achieving time travel at the Edison Labs, he actually became volubly angry when our neighbors were kind of scoffing at what he was saying. They were, employed by corporation or companies like Bell Labs and so forth. And my mother later said, after my father's death, that he was so angry at the closing of the Edison Labs, he wanted to go back and bomb the place. He wouldn't have done that. He had 5 kids. He was a peaceable man, but he was just volubly angry because they were on the threshold of achieving time travel. Sometime between 1964, when the Edison Labs closed, and when my dad he spent about a year at C.F. Braun, and then he was employed again for the first time by Ralph M. Parsons in 1966 when he was hired by a subsidiary of Parsons called Parsons Jordan Corporation, which publicly had one contract, which was the Anaconda copper contract in Chile, Anaconda being the huge Chilean copper producer. And in fact, mining sites like the Anaconda sites were being used to mask what my father was really being brought into, which was, in addition to helping Anaconda with its copper smelters, secretly they were cobbling together Project Pegasus, a time-space program, because the Los Alamos National Labs, whose director would be Harold Agnew by 1970, had Nikola Tesla's papers from 1945-45 forward, 44-45 forward, because two War Department officials beat two FBI agents to seize Tesla's paperwork upon his death at the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan on January 7th of 1943. So my father had repeated some of those experiments at the Edison Labs, and he got picked up by Parsons when Parsons got the time-space contract. The Ralph M. Parsons Company, by 1970, would literally give the United States government time travel. The two principal technologies were the Tesla teleporter, which opens up a vortal tunnel in the fabric of time-space through which the teleportee physically passes, namely the opposite of the quantum teleportation that was then, by 1966-67 was appearing on Star Trek on American television. The other principal device are devices called chronovisors. And what chronovision does is it propagates a hologram so dense, a field of light that is so dense by driving an electromagnetic signal through an 8-sided bismuth crystal that the hologram has a lensing effect by where the light patterns of non-local events, what we would call past or future events, or events going on in other dimensions, are lensed into the laboratory. When they experimented and they had somebody stand in the hologram, they found that that person subjectively experienced temporarily going to that non-local event. And I was involved in both of those activities extensively when I was in Project Pegasus. The other technology, primary technology, was the Montauk chair, which is a chair that you sit in that has a solenoid on the back of the chair behind your solar plexus, and it basically uses magnetic transduction to accentuate your basic psychic ability, basically the part of the brain that focuses on where you are in time-space. And that's used to bump the person forward in time, so they have a kind of astral projection of an event in their own future. That's all that the Montauk chair does. So I was involved in literally dozens of activities with each of those three technologies. I probably took 50 to 100, we call them rides or probes in the Montauk chair to my own future. I jumped through the Tesla devices at Curtiss Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey, and at the Sandia National Lab in Sandia, New Mexico, probably 100 times during that 3.5-year period when I was active. And then I was immersed in dozens of holograms of past events and a few holograms of future events. Okay, so now the import of this is that unbeknownst to the public, the global public, and most definitely the American people, while apocryphal stories have come out, some of them true, about things like the Philadelphia experiment, it was concealed from the American people that our great American civilization achieved something very mighty by 1970, which was different forms of time travel. And the physicists who would comment intelligently upon that conjecture, that proposition, have not been commenting authoritatively because they don't have access to the technology and never did. That would be Michio Kaku, Ronald Mallet in the United States, and then Stephen Hawking and David Deutsch in the United Kingdom. I know, however, and in fact I confronted Michio Kaku about the fact that I was a teleportee, and he snapped his back to me. He turned his back on me in the early 80s when I approached him at a speaking event of his in West Los Angeles when I was a student at UCLA. Okay, so I know the truth because I was in it. I will go to my grave, and I will never I will never capitulate, and I will never stop talking about what Project Pegasus accomplished, because I was in it. I know what we did. And when in adulthood, when I investigated my experiences, having never forgotten them, I proved the existence of the project. And I even had a presidential briefing about the existence of the project and the technologies. Now, am I advocating, just to kind of cut to the chase and kind of end this anecdote, am I advocating that we should introduce mass time travel by mass people? No. That would lead to mass chaos, because people would be operating on mass timelines. And just the flight of capital to Microsoft right before it became an initial public offering would cause social disruption. So I'm not advocating the mass access to time travel.
I'm sorry, I got lost with the Microsoft.
Say again?
I got lost at Microsoft. You're saying, like, as an example, Microsoft?
As an example, if people alive today who saw Microsoft and Apple and the other digital blue chips
I see.
double and triple and split and then double again and split again and basically go up by orders and orders of magnitudes in the last 30 years since they were IPOs, initial public offerings. If people had access to time travel, they could go back and buy those stocks when they were initial public offerings. And if enough people were time traveling, you could have a huge flight of capital to those corporations. So, Bill Gates could have cashed out with the flight of capital to his stock before even developing, an adequate version of Word and making the social contribution for which he was mightily rewarded monetarily. Okay, so it would be disruptive to allow the mass public to time travel, because a significant plurality of people would get involved in going back to do things like invest in later successful stocks from public stocks of successful companies. And they would do other things. They would consider getting divorced before they met the person that they fell in love and get married with. Because if they found out, let's say a guy who was richer than his wife, or he was employed and she was a housewife, if he found out that his marriage was only going to last 5 years and he was going to be taken to the cleaners in the divorce decree, then he might not even fall in love with that woman upon meeting her. He might go, oh, she's the woman I marry, and then am destituted by,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my point is, you can't introduce mass time travel, because it would completely screw up society. We would all be mad hatters, because we would be dealing with crises in our lives that were actually propagated by people traveling back in time to manipulate events. Okay? So that's not what I'm advocating. What I'm advocating the disclosure of the technologies, in the sense that the public would be informed of what the U.S. government has done. But in terms of mass social application of technology, I'm only calling for introduction of Tesla teleportation for real-time transport. So if you were in London and you had to fly to Sydney, Australia, you could get there in seconds rather than in 24 hours on a commercial passenger plane. I also think that maybe the Montauk chair is something that could be used in psychiatry, and maybe give somebody, free 15-minute Montauk chair rides to their future every 5 years or something like that.
Now, what would the benefit of that be?
That would be like, let's say somebody is suffering from a unipolar depression after losing a child. If they could virtually or vicariously visit their future and see that, the wife got pregnant again and she had a beautiful child and was happy again, the Montauk chair could be used in psychotherapy, for example, to lift people out of depression. A lot of depression, if somebody's not bipolar, if they just have unipolar depression, a lot of it is for unaddressed emotional pain or anger that doesn't get treated and manifests as depression. So if you could lift somebody's spirit by showing them that the future is going to be a lot better than the present, you would save a lot of people from suicide and from chronic depression. Okay, depression's more complex than that. There's known biomedical factors as well, certainly cofactors. But the Montauk chair could be used, in other words, as a form of psychotherapy to give people a sense of some of the exciting things that were going to happen in their life in the future. Because the Montauk chair bumps you forward to a little 15 or 20-minute episode where you you're literally living your life in the future. In other words, you're in your own shoes. It basically allows you to presage an actual personal event and not just see it, but experience it. And then you can come back and interpret what you saw, what you lived in that astral projection. So I would favor maybe partial introduction of that. And I'm also calling for limited access to chronovision. We don't want to, just like with teleportation, with time travel-based teleportation, we don't want to introduce chronovision just willy-nilly because it could be used to violate people's privacy. It could also be used, by the way, to violate the privacy of people in the past and future. And why should the United States government be involved in allowing people in society to look back in time, for example, or use chronovision in real time, for example, to invade people's sex lives and, create basically a pirated form of pornography? Okay, so we have to put government controls on private use of chronovision, or otherwise privacy will go by the wayside. But what I am calling for in the area of chronovision is that a public-private partnership at the federal level would produce chronovized scenes of auspicious moments in the past or educative moments in the past. So you could travel to a tenement in New York City in 1850 and see how horrible the conditions were for the poor in New York City. You could watch, you could go to the National Archives and watch a hologrammatic movie of George Washington in his Masonic apron laying the cornerstone of the Capitol on September 18th, 1793. I mean, really things that we have really no conception of. And then obviously the classic ones like, watch Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, etc. All that has been possible since 1970. The Smithsonian Institution could have already been dealing on a quantum level for the past 46 years and has not been. So we're several generations behind intelligent implementation of these technologies. And I want to be the president who rolls out the technologies because I was involved as a kid in their development. That's my destiny. That's my life's work.
So I want to go back just to get the timeline more clear. So
okay.
Your father worked at the Thomas A. Edison lab, and he was working on it, and it was close. He was close to time travel, and the lab was shut down, and he was very angry about this, and the lab's technology was moved to a clandestine operation in, what did you say, Colombia?
No. I was just making the point that Parsons Jordan, where he went to work in 1966, was a mining concern. And I found out in my investigation, and also when I went back and I viewed my experiences, that they were using mining sites both in the country and outside the country to secret some of the technologies. So it's not accidental that Parsons Jordan had one public contract that it talked about, which was the Anaconda Chile copper contract. But no, what happened was sometime in the midst, really the key thing in this area is that sometime around 1965-66, a group of people inside the U.S. government and the engineering community, the defense community, the defense contractors, said, wait a minute, let's cobble all these time travel-related technologies together and launch a secret program under DARPA. The principal company involved in that contract was Parsons, which then was known as the Ralph M. Parsons Company.
And your father did or did not work there?
My father did. He worked there from 1966 to 84, and then he retired.
Okay, after the Thomas Edison Labs, he went there.
No,
after a brief period.
In 64, and then he worked for C.F. Braun, or one of the other engineering firms in New Jersey. But then he went to work 2 years after leaving the Edison Labs and being disgusted that they had shut the Edison Labs down at the time that they were on the threshold of achieving time travel. My dad then gets picked up by Parsons in 66, and by the time he's employed by the Ralph M. Parsons Company per se in winter of 1968, I'm teleporting with him. So, and also when I went to Gettysburg, when he was there, he was like 4 or 5 years younger. So we can date the time that my dad began time traveling to like the mid-1960s. I was brought into the project by teleporting with him in 1968 when I was a 6-year-old. Okay, so that's sort of the timeline is, he graduates from Lehigh with a BS in electrical engineering in 1951. He does half of his degree program in electrical engineering, half in physics, a quarter in physics and a quarter in mathematics. And he works for Okonite and Curtis Wright in 51 and 52 to 55. He's at Curtis Wright after leaving Okonite. And then in 56 to 64, he works on a number of things at the Edison Labs, including repeating Nikola Tesla's teleportation experiments. And then he's disgusted when the Edison Labs close. And yet by 66, he's employed by Parsons, which based on my experiences and his, there's no question that Parsons was the defense contractor that had the Project Pegasus contract, the secret time-space exploration contract. In fact, my father and I were invited to the christening of the Pegasus 2 when Ralph Parsons bought what was then the world's largest private yacht from the Iranian businessman Adnan Khashoggi, and it was christened in Long Beach Harbor in 1972. So Parsons became so rich from Project Pegasus that he named the world's largest yacht after the program, Pegasus 2. And up until I started speaking out publicly, that fact was actually on the Parsons website. Okay, so by the mid-'60s, something is stirring within the American government. People like my father, Harold Agnew, who was one of the principal Manhattan Project physicists, and obviously people at Parsons before my dad got there, had determined that the United States should really now begin to focus on creating a time-space capability, because going all the way back to 1952, we saw what those devices had done above Washington, D.C. One thing they were doing was suddenly blinking out and then blinking back on again in some other location above the Capitol. So they were aware that whoever was responsible for those devices, presumably extraterrestrials or interdimensionals, they had mastered teleportation. So it was determined that we had to. But then when it was determined that we should have a teleportation capability, probably under the guidance of people like Agnew, who was a very intelligent man, they decided to create a broadly based time-space program to include other technologies, including chronovision, including the Montauk chair.
And what I keep getting a little lost in the timeline. So this is late 60s?
Yeah, Pegasus is fully operational by 68 because that's when I first teleported with my dad. And so since Parsons was proved out over time to be the principal, virtually the major, or not, I would say the primary defense contractor involved in giving the United States government a time-space capability, since my father went to work there at Parsons Jordan Corporation in 1966, a subsidiary of Ralph M. Parsons, that 1966-67 timeframe is when Project Pegasus would have been initiated, because I then teleport with my dad in winter of 1968. So in 66-67, the program actually had to begin. And we know that what he had been doing at the Edison Labs, but there was that 2-year gap between the Edison Labs and Parsons. So sometime during that gap, but no later than 66-67, within the U.S. government, there had been a decision made to create a time-space program. And that's what my father got picked up in, because he had repeated Tesla's experiments back at the Edison Labs from 56 to 64. And as a result, he became the chief technical consultant between Parsons and the CIA on the theory and practice of Tesla teleportation.
Is it all right if we take a 5-minute break?
Sure, I'm having a tickle too, so that would help me. So yeah, you just call me when I'll just make my bed here and do stuff, and just call me when it's convenient. I'll keep the phone on.
Yeah, I'm just gonna hit the restroom. I'll be back in 5-10 minutes.
Okay, sounds great.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.